I'm not a complicated man. I like cinema.
Spent that whole summer with me in my room watching movies every day.
I love the movies.
I love the movies.
I love the movies.
Welcome
To the house
of 1,000 movies.
Is the Sawyer family the craziest family ever put on film? I don't know. You could make that argument. Those the family from House of 1,000 Corpses, they're up there too. But man, the Sawyer family was nuts. They were insane. And you ever noticed Sawyer, Saw, right in the beginning, Texas Chain Saw, the Sawyer family, maybe a coincidence, maybe not. I don't know. But today you're here to listen to me talk about the 1974 horror classic, the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, which is possibly a top 10 movie for me, definitely a top 2 horror movie. Halloween and Texas Chain Saw Massacre, I think 2 of the most influential movies ever made and 2 of the best horror movies ever made, which of course we'll cover Halloween on the podcast at some point since it's a top 5 movie for me, period. But Texas Chain Saw Massacre, I have such an interesting take on that I wanted to share. I was on a podcast with Jake Boston, who does the Steelbook Obsessed. He runs that content. So he's got, YouTube, but he's probably more well-known for like TikTok and Instagram content. And I was on his podcast and we were talking about this movie and I had some like thoughts. I was like, this is really good off the cuff. Like, let me try to put some of this down and record it. So that's why this one came up. Of course, this podcast, House of 1,000 Movies. First of all, welcome to House of 1,000 Movies. I should say that. I'm your host, Jeff Rauseo. But this podcast is all about movies that I love. And so I'm not going in any particular order. We will have some themed months, like October is going to be all horror movies and December will be Christmas movies. And we'll kind of theme it, as this podcast goes along. But I just wanted to talk about this one because I had so many things to share. We're going to jump in. We'll do production, box office, background on the film. We'll talk cast and crew. I'll give you my take on the movie and some of my analysis. We'll talk where you can watch it, physical media, streaming, whatever's available. And then we'll get into some fun facts and a little movie trivia for you to take away and bring up at your next party. So let's kick right into it today with the production of Texas Chain Saw Massacre because it's a nutty one. It really is. It was a shoestring budget. You're talking about $140,000 is the estimate, which, yeah, it sounds like kind of a lot of money in the 70s, but not really. A lot of movies were being made for a lot more money. This was very much an indie movie, a low budget film. It wasn't $10,000, but also hard to do that in those times without all the available equipment. So a lot of that stuff is just literally like equipment rentals and paying for that sort of thing, which was way more expensive than it is now, where you could probably shoot the Texas Chain Saw Massacre on like a $50 camera, right? But they couldn't do that back then. So the budget, it was shoestring for them, even though it might sound a little bit higher when you hear some horror movies today being made for, $10,000 or $20,000. Yeah, it's less money, but different times. And they shot this whole thing in Red Hut, rural Texas. I mean, sweltering heat, cast and crew, just disgusting, sweaty, dirty the whole time. Like, that was authentic. What you see on camera, that was real. They were sweaty. They were hot. They were tired. They were just gross. And it added to the griminess of the film. And they had a ton of challenges. They had bad weather. They had some logistical nightmares getting equipment out to rural Texas. But honestly, rather than kind of giving up and succumbing to the obstacles, Tobe Hooper, director, and his team just kind of embraced them and just transformed that into what this project became. It was an opportunity, like I said, to enhance the authenticity and the impact that this movie was going to have on audiences. It was authentic. They felt like they were lost in rural Texas for parts of this movie because I think sometimes they were. And all of that commitment and just determination and grit and grime, I mean, it sounds corny, but that's what really laid the groundwork for this movie and cemented itself into the horror movie Hall of Fame. Now, when the movie was released in 1974, it just bust into theaters right out of the gate. Audiences were terrified. It was a huge word of mouth sensation. And the whole like based on a true story thing, which is it sort of, I know a lot about kind of true crime and serial killers, for better or worse. I know that stuff. I'm into it. It's sort of based on Ed Gein in a way, but like so was Norman Bates, and nobody would put Norman Bates and Leatherface really in the same conversation. So there's like elements from a real serial killer. He was actually more of like a grave robber. But other than that, like the elements of like, the human face mask and everything and kind of the butchery of people versus animals, like there wasn't much really tied to a true story other than kind of rural weirdo who makes masks out of human flesh, which, yeah, I mean, that's disturbing enough to be tied to a true story. But there was no Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There was no chainsaw killer. But I don't think you could tell audiences that because they believed it. I'm sure in its time period, this was Blair Witch Project levels of like, this really happened. This is insane. And the way it's shot just added to the sheer terror and thrill of the audiences. And even though it had a lot of opposition, you had censors who were ripping on this movie, critics ripping on this movie. It was pushing limits. It was just unapologetic. And it was horror at its finest. And audiences that were hungry for something like that came out and watched it. And it made $31 million at the box office, which on a $140,000 budget is one hell of a return. I'm sure Tobe Hooper and the production team were very thrilled with that one. Now, although it had this kind of controversy, it really did kind of emerge from that. It was triumphant at the box office. It did get actually pretty decent critical acclaim for its approach to the storytelling, the way it was shot, some of the camera techniques, which are very cool. The whole production, there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears literally put into this thing. And critics really liked that raw intensity, the impact it had, that visceral impact, and Tobe Hooper's just uncompromising vision. His cast and his crew and himself, they committed to this thing, and you could tell it felt real. And you can always tell when somebody doesn't commit to a project. They were all committed on this one. And now, of course, beyond 1974, the cultural impact of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's huge, right? There have been many sequels. Tobe Hooper did Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which was a drastic shift, but then you had like the Next Generation, the Leatherface, you had The Beginning, you had the remake in 2003, you had the recent sequel in 2022, you had Texas Chainsaw 3D. It has a classic video game now that a lot of people are very happy with. That's doing a ton of numbers, a very cool horror video game. I mean, it's the Leatherface masks fly off the shelf every October. He's an iconic character. The chainsaw is a staple in every haunted house across the world now. And that was all Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw, Tobe Hooper's vision. That's all from this movie. The cultural impact is massive, whether you're in Japan, Europe, the United States. It's been controversial and banned in many places. It was a video nasty in the UK. You couldn't even get a VHS tape of this thing for like 15 years. It was banned in Germany, of all places, until like the mid 2000s or something insane. But no matter where it was and where it went, it had that cultural impact, and all the bans and the controversy probably added to it. It became more iconic. And so for cast and crew, right, Tobe Hooper, he was behind the scenes on this one. He was the director. This was his one of his first movies. He had done some small movies, but this is one of his first movies. He went on to then work on like The Funhouse. He did Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. He did Invaders from Mars, a remake of that film. And he was working with cinematographer Daniel Pearl. And the cinematography in Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of its best aspects. It's incredible cinematography. In fact, that iconic shot of Sally kind of walking up to the house in her red shorts, and it's kind of shot almost like from the ground. The way that the film was shot, where you feel like you're almost seeing something you're not supposed to see, right? It's this documentary style of filmmaking, this guerrilla filmmaking that wasn't really popular then. This was unlike anything anybody had seen. And the other crazy thing about the cinematography is like the way it was shot, there's almost no blood or gore. So it's shot very creatively, and it's all sort of in your imagination. They wanted this film to be rated PG, and I think it got like an X rating or NC-17. They wouldn't even release it. They had to cut it even further to get an R-rated release, or eventually an unrated release, I think. But they thought it might be rated PG because there's actually no gore. It's terrifying, but there's really no blood. There's no slasher moments. There's nobody getting cut in half with a chainsaw. It's all kind of in your head, and that's all camera tricks and what Daniel Pearl was able to do. And he worked together with Hooper on a few projects like The Funhouse, and that collaboration was insane, insanely good on The Funhouse as well. Then of course we got Marilyn Burns. She's the highlight here for me, other than Gunnar Hansen, who we'll get to, but she's Sally Hardesty. She is the original. Can I say the original Scream Queen? I can't really. That was really like Janet Leigh and Psycho. But I mean, she's one of the OG Scream Queens, up to Jamie Lee Curtis, who's Janet Leigh was her mother, interestingly enough. But one of those OGs. You got, Black Christmas and some other movies that came out in this time period, but that final girl scream queen thing was pretty new. And her emotion, the screams, the pure terror, I mean, she committed fully. And, you kind of wonder, was half of it because the production was so horrible and grueling to go through? And, I think those screams had a little extra oomph to them because of that. But she fought tooth and nail for survival against all these horrors. She's fighting Leatherface and his family. She's sitting down to dinner with them in one of the most creepy, terrifying scenes in movie history. And she's fully committed throughout all of it. She gives an incredible, incredible performance, which will put her in the Horror Hall of Fame as well. She did a few horror genre projects after that. She was in a film called Eaten Alive and Future Kill, but that was really it. So Marilyn Burns as Sally, this is kind of her shining moment. And I think a lot of actresses out there and actors would hope that they had a moment like this, because this is an incredible performance. And then, of course, Gunnar Hansen, the man behind the mask, Leatherface himself. Just this towering presence, this towering man, and just primal ferocity. He left an impact on everybody. And, you don't see him or his face. And I think that's a super hard thing to do. Like, I give those people credit, like anybody who plays Ghostface or Nick Castle in Halloween, or James Jude Courtney in the new Halloween movies, or, these killers that hide behind a mask, like Kane Hodder, who played Jason in so many Jason sequels. And like all these guys, that you have to really commit when you can't show any facial emotions, really. And Hansen does that. I mean, he's terrifying, and it's all just like presence, and it's all just the way he carries himself. And, Leatherface is this kind of unhinged, loose cannon, definitely mentally handicapped in a way, but just also just, you feel sympathy at a time. Like he's defending his house. He's just doing what his family's telling him to do. He's just, kind of a bumblebutt who got a chainsaw and thinks he's being attacked. These random people showed up to his house. They came into his house. For him, this is a terrifying experience. And when you watch the movie, Gunnar Hansen, you can see that a little bit. He's almost childlike in a way, and is like, especially the end of the movie, like it's so iconic, but so happy and excited, like, like a child would be, that he scared these people away, that they're gone from his house. He took care of them, and he's swinging his chainsaw around. And it's like, his performance is really great. He's done a few other movies since. He did Leatherface, but Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers, that's a cult film if you've ever seen it. He was also in the movie Mosquito, which is a kind of bananas creature feature, which I do have in my collection. It has a great Blu-ray release from Synapse Films, might be Severin, but I think it's Synapse. But just a formidable presence, just that body type, that huge presence that he had in the movie. He really didn't have to do much else but kind of just swing his weight around and be that presence, be, in Halloween terms, the shape. But that's what he was. Terrifying, terrifying moments, and a great actor. And so, my take on Texas Chainsaw and some of the reasons I love the film. One of them is definitely kind of like Jaws, which we talked about last episode, where they don't show the shark. The thing about Texas Chainsaw is they don't show the gore. They don't show the blood. They don't show the attacks. And I think, Texas Chainsaw has less blood than Jaws has in it by a mile. It's just more disturbing. But Jaws was rated PG. Texas Chainsaw was rated R. And I think it's like censors were they were disturbed by their own minds, what they were thinking in their own minds. And yeah, it's all disturbing. You're seeing a girl get hung up on a meat hook, but you don't see it. You don't see it. You see it happen from the front. You don't see anything. Nothing goes, there's no blood. There's no gore. You don't see it go into her. None of that stuff. So it's interesting what people's minds were doing at the time. And one of my thoughts on that is that I think it has a lot to do with the culture of America, specifically America, but also the world in that time period. Because in that time period, right, the early 70s, so you're coming out of the late 60s and into the early 70s. The 60s were an insane decade. You had, a president get assassinated in front of a huge crowd. It's caught on film. People have seen it. You have the Vietnam War, and that's being captured on film for like really the first time, and being broadcast back to homes quickly. Like other wars were caught on. World War II was recorded, Korean War, World War One even probably has some moments, but it wasn't broadcast back into people's homes on a nightly basis. So that availability to information changed things. They were seeing horrific things that, you might have read about in the paper, but it's different to see it on your TV screen in your house. And then of course, you have Malcolm X, you have Martin Luther King, you have Bobby Kennedy, all getting assassinated. You have, just this super tumultuous time full of violence. And you also have serial killers running rampant in this time period. You have, the Son of Sam in the summer of in New York. You have the Zodiac killer. I mean, this stuff is happening. And there's a bunch of other serial killers who weren't caught too many years later or were never caught, like Zodiac, who, in the 60s and 70s and then into the 80s, of course, was just a wild time to be alive in America. You had the counterculture movement and all this violence happening on the other side and protests everywhere and, violence at Kent State and just so much happening. And you were getting that pushed into your house on a nightly basis. And you saw this violence in the world in a way that I don't think people had ever seen violence before. Like you'd open up a newspaper and 3 weeks after the Battle of the Bulge, you might hear about it in the newspaper. News didn't travel as quickly. It wasn't recorded. It wasn't being streamed into your house through, the 3 news stations that you had access to. So that all changed. It all changed for America. America was a very violent place in the 60s and 70s, and it was a violent world. There was war everywhere, and there were terrorist attacks, and it was a crazy time. And I think that's in people's heads. And I think there's some commentary in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whether it's intentional or not, that the whole point is like your own mind will fill in the blanks and make it even more disturbing than Tobe Hooper and his team could have made it. They could have just made a splatter film and had blood everywhere and done like the Herschel Gordon Lewis thing and just been bloodbath, but they didn't. And I think they maybe part of them knew like what people are going to envision, what they've seen on the news, what they've seen on TV, potentially what they've seen in real life, as all these Vietnam vets are coming home from Vietnam, is way worse than anything we could put on film. It's way worse than what we could show them. So let's take that element out of it and let's just let the imagination run wild. And there's also commentary in this, I think, on, who's the greatest monster on Earth. And it's not a killer shark. It's not killer animals. It's not, whatever diseases, viruses. It's not aliens, even, real or not, like none of those things that are in movies. None of that is as scary as and it's not supernatural. That's the other thing. Not supernatural, right? It's not a supernatural killer. It's not a ghost. It's not some, possessed creature. It's none of that stuff. It's purely just, and this is coming on the heels of The Exorcist, right? That terrified people, but that's possession. That's devil stuff. It's satanic. It's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just pure deranged people. Like these are people you could run into in rural America on any corner. And yeah, that's probably an exaggeration, but also based on some things I've seen, it may not be. I've seen the videos on YouTube. I've seen the stuff, there's a guy, Soft White Underbelly, who goes out and interviews these people in really tough areas. And it's like some of the stuff you see is scary. It's really scary to somebody who just lives kind of a normal average life. It's out there in the corners of America and the rural, farms and kind of this open land that's out in Texas or out in the deserts or, out in West Virginia somewhere. I mean, there's these corners of the world that are scary and there's these corners of the country that are scary. And, man is the scariest beast on earth, which is a common theme in horror. But, the humanity of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a guy in a mask. It's a family. They don't have any superpowers. In fact, they got like an old grandfather who can't move. They got another old guy who's kind of, he doesn't move very quickly. They got a young crazy Leatherface with a chainsaw. They got the other unhinged, brother, cousin there, and they're just human. And you just happen to walk into the wrong place and mess with the wrong people. And now, obviously, in so many movies, that's been played on. And I think House of a Thousand Corpses is probably the closest thing that I've seen to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a movie I love, obviously, podcast name, House of a Thousand Movies. Um, but it's spawned so many others that are just like, humanity is scary. Humanity and man, we are the scariest. And what we will do to each other, honestly, is worse than most filmmakers can imagine. What we do to each other, what we have done to each other over history, what we will do to fellow men and fellow women and fellow creatures on this planet is above and beyond what you could even write into a script. And that's why reality is the scariest thing. And that's why the scariest movies for me are the ones that are set in reality. Like, the supernatural stuff does not scare me. That's just not my type of fear. I like those movies, but it doesn't scare me. They're more cool. They're more interesting to me. The stuff that scares me is Texas Chainsaw. It's House of a Thousand Corpses. It's The Strangers. The Funny Games. It's these movies where it's just like that could happen. That could happen tomorrow to anybody. That's a terrifying prospect. So that's kind of my take on it. I do think the reason it was so successful and the reason that they didn't need to show as much gore to have an impact is really just America at the time. The way our culture was and the way the American mindset was all over the place, and it was violent. But bringing it forward a little bit, why I love this movie, why I became to love it, is, I'm growing up in the 90s. So this movie's been out for almost 20 years by the time I'm born in 1992. The movie's old news, right? But it's still relevant. And it's really funny because the way that this kind of got on my radar was through video stores. And you'll see it, you see it on the shelf and you see Texas Chainsaw Massacre and it's based on a true story. And as a kid, you're like, what the hell is this? Like, you see the artwork, it's terrifying. But then as you get older, it almost became like an urban legend. Like, I distinctly remember my mother, who's into horror movies, telling me that was the scariest movie she'd ever seen. And she would have been right in that right age range to have seen it, not maybe when it first came out, she would have been too young, but to have seen it when it was still fairly new. She probably watched some version of it in the 80s, VHS tape or whatever, or on TV, if they even showed it on TV. I don't think they did. But she was like, the scariest movie I've ever seen. And you talk to other kids at school or whatever, you talk about movies, and it was just like, what's the scariest movie of all time? It's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, hands down. Like, that was always the answer. It was like this urban legend of, this is the scariest movie ever made. It's based on a true story. This really happened. And, you see clips of it and you're like, oh my God, like, this looks like a home video recording, which pre-Blair Witch kind of blows your mind. You've never seen anything like it. So then you start, your 10-year-old mind starts questioning, is this real? Is this real footage? Is this, terrified me. Absolutely. I had never seen it and it terrified me. And then in 2003, so I'm 11 years old at that point, 2003, the remake comes out, which, if you haven't seen the 2003 remake, pretty good in its own right. One of the better horror movie remakes, retellings out there. But that comes out, I'm 11 years old, and I have this burned into my memory. I'm watching the Red Sox in the World Series. So it's the fall of 2003. The movie's just about to come out because I think it comes out in October. So I'm staying up later than I usually would as an 11-year-old to watch playoff games. They lose to the Yankees that year in the ALCS. They win the next year, reverse the curse. This was hot time for baseball and as a baseball kid. So I was watching every game, staying up late, and the commercials would come on for that trailer, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And again, they're playing it up. It's based on a true story, and the quick shots and that music, the like snapshot of like the light going. They were using that iconic, the pew, pew, like, it was terrifying. It was a terrifying trailer, and it was just like a teaser trailer. They didn't show much, but it was like the opening of Texas Chainsaw with that, like the flashing and the sound. And obviously I did not just do that sound any justice at all. But if you know what I'm talking about, it's like a camera flash that goes off, like a snapshot. And it was so scary. And like, I like wouldn't be able to sleep because of just seeing 30 seconds of that. And so then that cemented in my brain. I'm like, oh my God, this movie. And now this is the scariest movie and they're remaking it. It's the scariest movie ever made. What are they doing? And so I finally saw the movie when I was probably like, I don't know, 15 or 16. I don't really remember. I was a teenager by the time I saw it. I think I just saw it on like a DVD copy or something. It was nothing special, but watching it was so cool because you finally see that. First of all, you come in with so much hype because you're like, this is the scariest movie ever made. And watching it, gore and slashers don't scare me. And by that time, I, grown up, other things were scaring me. That didn't scare me. So it didn't really scare me, but it did chill me and it made me feel uncomfortable. And I was like, I've never seen anything like this, which is why it's so like frozen in my head, that memory of it. And it was just so cool to be able to like finally that urban legend of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like sit down with it, watch it, enjoy it. And now I've watched it, I don't know, God, 10 times at least. It's not like something you put on all the time. You don't put on Texas Chainsaw when you have friends over because they're going to be like, what the fuck's wrong with you? That's a crazy movie hey, depends on the friends, I guess. I guess it depends on the friends. Some might enjoy that. But yeah, it's just not one you like sit down and you're like, I need something to watch, something that's a little laid back and fun. Hey, Texas Chainsaw. It's like, nah, I watch it in October or that time period, September, October. I watch it in the fall. I might watch it in the summer once because it's a great summer movie too, that red hot Texas heat. But I've seen it so many times and you find something each time that you really love. You find a little piece of a performance or you notice a little camera trick that you didn't notice before. You think, oh, that shot, that was really unique. That was really cool. There's so much about it. And it was like really a progressive movie because if you look at the cast and you've got a guy in a wheelchair and, kind of the main cast and yeah, they brutally kill him. But when's the last time you saw that in a horror movie? Just representation. You had really strong female characters, which was not something that was in so many horror movies. I'd have to go back to like, I can't even say Psycho because honestly in Psycho, they make her out to be kind of weak and she just screams and dies right away. So you had these really cool, characters, a progressive cast, a really progressive way of making the movie. It's just such an incredible, timeless film that if you've never seen, it's a must see. Even if you don't love the horror genre, at this point in time, trust me, you've seen worse stuff on the internet than what's in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's probably not going to scare most people in 2024 because we're now so jaded. Think about what the violence was in the 60s and 70s, what you saw on TV. Now we got the internet. We're so jaded. We're so desensitized to a lot of this stuff that it probably won't bother you, especially with some of the movies coming out like Terrifier or, the Human Centipede or stuff that's taken us to a new level of disturbing. Texas Chainsaw isn't that. So I'd recommend it. But even if you're not a horror fan, I would recommend it because it's just beautifully crafted and really well shot and really interesting. And the scenery is great. The characters are great. The script is nothing special. It's a low budget horror movie. It's what you should expect, but it's so elevated. It's so above that. And I think it's just one of the most iconic pieces of film that's ever been made. And if you're at all interested in film history, horror or otherwise, it's a movie you just have to see. So now let's talk about where you can watch this thing. If you want to see it, how can you watch it? Now, to check streaming, I'm on justwatch.com, a great resource. Hey, Just Watch, if you hear this, dude, sponsor this podcast. I'm shouting you guys out. You're getting a ton of traffic. But you go to justwatch.com, put it in. There are a couple of free options. You can watch it on Peacock. You can watch it on Tubi. You can watch it on the Roku channel. You can watch it on Pluto TV, Freevee. There are a few options out there. My guess is that most of those are going to be a really grimy, old restoration, an old version of the movie. They're going to look really rough, which for Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not the worst thing in the world. However, there have been several restorations of the movie over the years that have taken it to a new level, which still retain the griminess, but just allow you to see so much more. If you do want to get that higher level, Apple TV has a 4K version for rent. And if you have paid subscriptions to AMC Plus, you can watch it through there. You can watch it through Shudder. You can watch it through Screenbox, which is an Amazon channel, another great streaming service. So there's plenty of options. You can buy it in all the usual places too. The Prime Videos, Vudu's, YouTube, Google Play, you name it. It's out there to buy. But the way I would watch it, as I would watch most things, is by getting a physical media version. And there's plenty of options. Now, I have, again, a lot of options for Texas Chainsaw in my collection. I have a sealed VHS tape from 1993, which was the first release of the uncut version of the film without any censorship. But there are VHS tapes. There are dozens of DVD copies. There's a great Blu-ray copy. There's a couple Blu-ray copies, but there's a great 40th anniversary. That would be the one to buy if you want HD Blu-ray. It has a great restoration on it. And then just recently, within the last couple of years, they have fully restored the movie in 4K, where it looks the greatest it's ever looked. I imagine this is how like Tobe Hooper would have loved it to look. It retains all of the griminess and all of the grain, and it's 16 millimeter. It retains all of that, but it's just beautifully restored, and the colors are incredible, which I know is a focus point for this film. They really did emphasize a lot of the colors, especially the reds, oranges, yellows. The heat in the film kind of radiates off the screen. So I love that with the HDR and the 4K, and you have multiple options. There's one in the US released by Dark Sky Films. They own the rights to Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the US. They have a 4K release, which is grimy but great. It's probably the most authentic. Then there's a second sight release, which is available in the UK, but you can buy it from certain retailers. That one was their own restoration, which is a little bit less grime. They cleaned it up, did some additional work to clean up, and it's the best the film's ever looked. But if you want that grindhouse, grimy feel, the American restoration's better. And then there is also a German version. If you're out in Germany, Turbine Media in Germany has a 4K release. So it's pretty widely available. Again, a movie that if you walk into a pawn shop, like a lot of these movies, you should be able to find a Blu-ray for $2 or $3 at a used store, even on Amazon or eBay. If you just want to get a Blu-ray copy, they're widely available. They're fairly cheap. And even the 4K release now, at least in the US, I've seen it go for like $10 to $15. So if you're gonna pay for it on Apple TV and rent it for $4 or buy it for 10 or whatever it's selling for, again, my advice would be go out and buy a physical media copy. There's a bunch of different releases with incredible artwork and so many special features, which are super interesting on this film. And this year is its 50th anniversary. 2024 is its 50th anniversary. So I'm really excited to see if come like October, maybe we get some screenings of that in theater. I would love to see that 4K restoration screened in a theater. I've never seen Texas Chainsaw on the big screen. I would pay money to go watch that with an audience. It'd be a ton of fun, but maybe some cool events at different conventions and things like that. But a big anniversary, 50th anniversary for one of the greatest horror films ever made. So now for a little movie trivia, fun facts. One of the fun facts is, I think I mentioned this, but it was one of the video nasties in the UK, censorship, which if you want to learn more about that, it's a super interesting piece of home video history and film history and censorship. I did a whole like mini documentary on my YouTube channel about the video nasties in the 80s in the UK, the impact that had on film and home video, all the banned movies, Evil Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, so many films that got banned that people didn't have real access to for a long time. So it was part of that. The censorship by the BBFC killed the release of Texas Chainsaw in the UK, which honestly, it's kind of like the Streisand effect, right? It made it more iconic. By pointing it out and by banning it, you always make a film more iconic. It brings more attention to it. Also, really cool note here, but Marilyn Burns, when she was chased by Leatherface through the undergrowth and kind of like is cutting herself up on the branches, that was actually pretty real. She actually did cut herself on a bunch of the branches pretty badly. And so, allegedly a lot of the blood on her body and her clothes is real blood. And that's the authentic griminess of that low budget production and what you get from something like that. Like there's low budget horror movies that have some pretty crazy behind the scenes facts like that, where it's like, oh yeah, that was real blood because the person was actually hurt, actually bleeding, and that was what we had. We didn't have stuntmen. We didn't have a bunch of fake blood. And then interestingly enough, I talked about this with like the lack of gore in the movie, the lack of actual gore, on-screen gore. The only time that a chainsaw is actually seen cutting the flesh on screen is at the very, very end, and it's Leatherface's own leg. Other than that, they never show the chainsaw actually cutting flesh. They just don't. They don't show that in the film. And it was the last shot in the film. And apparently, this Tobe Hooper, this is crazy. This is what I mean by like low budget stuff. Tobe Hooper was wearing a metal plate over his leg, and it was covered with a piece of meat in a blood bag. So they used real meat in a blood bag. But the scream was genuine because the chainsaw kept hitting the plate, and then the friction from the chainsaw hitting the metal plate made the plate get super hot and actually burned his leg. So he was actually screaming in pain, not from a chainsaw, but from the fact that his leg was burning up. And there's a lot of stories like this from the set when we talk about like a grimy, low budget production. The cast and crew, they wanted to quit. They wanted to give up. You know, Gunnar Hansen was fed up with Tobe Hooper. There's a whole lot of really interesting behind the scenes stuff that you can dive into with this movie because it's kind of a miracle it got made. They were rushed through it. They had to get the camera equipment back. They had to get the rental equipment back. It was, 120 degrees. They were all sweaty, literally bleeding their own blood, just getting put through the ringer. An insane story. Definitely not something that would fly today, but created this iconic film. So if you're at all interested, definitely check some of those like special features in the Blu-ray releases, or obviously hop on YouTube or somewhere else and look for some of those behind the scenes things because it's pretty wild. So that's it for this episode. That is my take on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you found it interesting what I was talking about. And seriously, if you want to dive into some more of that history of the time period in America, I'm a history nerd, so I should say, like, I should put that as a disclaimer. Like, I went to college and got a political science and history degree. Like, I'm a liberal arts guy. I love history. I love political science. I love current events. I'm very up to date on all that. I love that stuff. That's where a lot of my love for movies comes from because they're so intertwined. But if you want to dive into that history of the 60s and the 70s, and then some of the movies that came out of that time period, because I think people were just fed up and they were just looking for outlets, and they were just like, the world seems like it's so horrible right now. And that's why you had some of these really dark, disturbing movies come out. That run, that time period where you had like a Black Christmas, a Texas Chainsaw, you had a Halloween a few years later, you had Jaws, you had The Exorcist, you had Rosemary's Baby, you had like this really interesting time period in horror history. And there's other movies sprinkled in there too, like The Sentinel. People were fed up. People were really fed up. And I think the movies often reflect society. I would highly recommend like diving deeper into that history, American history, then rewatching some of these movies and maybe getting a new appreciation for them, and maybe viewing them in a bit of a different way. Definitely worth your time if you're at all interested in history. But thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. What did I just say? Watching. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. God, at the end of these, sometimes I'm just like, my brain is so on Texas Chainsaw mode. And now I have to talk to you guys like a normal human again. Watching. That's insane. But thank you for watching. If you're on YouTube, incredible. Make sure you're subscribed. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Appreciate the support. If you're listening, I love that too. Love connecting with you guys on whatever platform, Spotify, Apple. We're going to be everywhere. So I appreciate the early support. The response to this has been really cool. I'm so happy that these episodes are getting out to you. And I just can't wait to talk about more movies, bring on some guests, potentially bring on just some viewers who want to chat about a favorite movie. Like, this would be a really cool opportunity to just talk to some of you guys about a movie you love. But that's what this podcast is. It celebrates movies, celebrates the love of movies. I'm going to keep talking about movies I love, why I love them, give you some of these interesting tidbits of information and some of the behind the scenes stuff. Hopefully you learn a thing or two by listening or watching. Hopefully it's enjoyable. And of course, please, any feedback, any way I can change this up, make it better, make it, different, anything you'd want to hear more of, please let me know. You can do it on YouTube, obviously, in the comments. Be nice. You can also do it on Spotify. You could email me, whatever. There's a lot of ways to get in touch. DM me on Instagram, on social media, but please give me feedback. I want to kind of learn as I do this and change the way I do it and, adapt as I learn more about how this is working. But hopefully these first couple have been enjoyable so far, and I really appreciate the response. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy, keep watching great movies, and I'll talk to you all soon. Hey there, movie buff. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of House of 1,000 Movies. I hope you had as much fun listening as I did discussing some of my favorite films. Don't forget, if you're into video podcasts, you can head over to the YouTube channel and hit the subscribe button. If you're already on YouTube, it's right there, so why not hit it? And for our audio listeners, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. If you've been enjoying the show, why not show me some love by leaving a 5-star review? It really helps me out, and it lets me know that I'm hitting the mark. And hey, before you go, a quick shout out to our sponsors. By supporting them, you're not just supporting the show, but also the content you love. Thanks again for joining me in the House of 1,000 Movies. Until next time, keep watching, keep listening, and keep watching great movies. Take care, everyone.